Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining the first session of 2026 of the Transparency series. We have been already quite active on 2025, exploring different topics on transparency and pharmaceutical policy. And for this year's first session, we want to start with an exploratory topic that is how the access to medicines is being affected by securitization practices. So for today, we have two wonderful panelists that will join us for explore the same topic from two different angles. And then we will start the questions and answers section, and we'll try myself to link what we have been discussing to specifically policy developments that we are seeing both in Europe and globally. Please post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A section. I will be checking them throughout the session, and then some days after we will share the presentations and probably a readout. You will have access to the recording after the finalization of the event. I will first introduce to Laëtitia Sédou, who has been working as the Disarm Europe project lead at the European Network Against Arms Trade, ENAT, since 2016, focusing in particular on EU subsidies to the arms industry, the roles of the arms industry as a corporate lobby influencing EU defense policies, and how this exacerbates the global arms race. And before joining ENAT, Laëtitia gained extensive experience in advocacy at European level on issues related to human rights and democracy. For many of you, she's probably a new face, but we have invited her today to the Access to Movement webinars because she's an expert on how different tools that are interconnected both with weapons and medicines can have an impact on access to medicine. So she will give us the overall picture. Then we will explore with Heba Wanis from Third World Network, who I will present later on how this is developing in Egypt, and then we will wrap it up everything in the moderation in the last Q&A section. So Laëtitia, over to you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jaime. I will share my screen first. Okay, I hope you can see that. Okay. So indeed, thanks a lot for inviting me to address your session, although it may seem a bit of a faraway topic. But I think there is increasing awareness that within these European defense readiness policies that we usually call EU militarization in a kind of more provocative way, it's impacting now almost all, if not all areas, all civil sectors and areas. So it's quite important to understand how things happened for you to know what to expect and be ready to face the possible challenges. Because we see for the last 10 years that this security and defense lens has significant consequences on traditional or normal transparency, democratic and accountability processes. Whether it's justified or not is another discussion, but I think it's important to be ready and to be aware of what will happen. So as you can see, the problems in fact started right from the beginning of this new policy for military industry. Already in the first pilot programs created to fund military research and development to develop new weaponry. An example we give regularly is this group of personalities created in 2016. It doesn't exist anymore, but it's important to see that a majority of members of this group, 9 out of 16, were representative of the arms industry, while the objective of the group was to advise the EU, the Commission in particular, on the need or not and on the modalities to start funding military research and development. And this group was, for kind of formal reasons, not considered an expert group, meaning that it could escape the normal rules of transparency under expert groups. The European Commission has a register of expert groups, which includes quite a lot of groups from industry. So they have to obey to transparency rules. So the fact to try and escape those rules was already per se, I would say, a bad signal.
Sorry, Laëtitia.
Yes.
Presentations are not moving. So I think you're on the next slide already.
Yes, it didn't move for you because it did move for me. I mean, the second slide with 2017, you don't see that?
I think we're all frozen in the previous one, but
Okay.
I can try now.
Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, I will share it for you. I'm opening it now.
Okay. Yeah, so that's it. That's on the second one. So the first issue was this group of personalities escaping normal transparency rules. A second key point is the fact that the normal parliamentary oversight on the program implementation was also suppressed. So normally when the EU has funding for a given sector, the European Parliament can in particular oversight and comment on the annual work programs to have a kind of role in the implementation. This was suppressed under the argument of novelty, because this was a new pilot program in a new area of work for the Commission. And also it was an argument of the limited time frame for implementation, because it was a quite short program. But that's problematic as a principal matter per se, and we will see later why it is so problematic, but also problematic because due to confidentiality arguments and security arguments and interests, the basic text, the basic definition of these programs for military research and development were less detailed than normal. So to a certain extent, we were losing about transparency on both levels, at the initial period or text, and also during implementation. A third key issue I want to raise also, which is particularly concerning for us, is the lack of transparency on the ethical issues and on ethical checks. The list of experts which supports the European Commission for evaluating the project proposals, but also the ethical assessments, is not public. Again, it's a difference compared to normal civil programs. So we are already losing some form of transparency there. And on top of it, we have a very little information on the actual ethical procedures, how those assessments are being conducted, what are the benchmarks, the criteria. There is very little information about it. And what we have as information indicates that this is not up to the task and to the importance of the challenge. We can move to the next slide. Then what happened after in the years following those pilot programs? Well, we could see that all the initial problems or shortfalls were in fact maintained or even strengthened as becoming the new norm under the normal or routine programs, in particular the big EU Defence Fund with 8 billion euros. While the Parliament had in fact accepted to get rid of its oversight right I was mentioning before, only as an exception and against the promise that they would get this power back after the pilot program for the kind of normal program. This never happened. Until today, they never got this power of oversight on annual programs for the Defence Fund, but for none of the other instruments that have been then adopted in the following year, they never got this possibility back. Yet they keep voting in favor of those instruments. Another important point is that despite conclusions and recommendations from the EU Ombudsman, there was no improvement either as regards the ethical assessments and the related transparency. In fact, they are more and more largely based on self-evaluation by the applicants themselves. Arms companies, research groups, etc. And from our point of view, that's particularly problematic also because there is a symbiotic relationship between the European Commission and the arms industry. Another point of concern is that still under this argument of confidentiality, including commercial confidentiality and European security interests, there are very little details provided on the content of the projects that are funded, about the more detailed technologies, about the ethical elements, about the risks for civilians, etc., etc. Even for the MEPs, for the Euro parliamentarians, having access to this information is complicated and very limited. This renders the last tool of oversight that the Parliament have, which is the midterm reviews or midterm evaluation, also a kind of useless exercise. Normal EU programs have a duration of 7 years, so in the middle they have this called midterm evaluation process. In that case, it's almost impossible to read because no one has really no outside actor or watchdog role or MEPs can have access to this information to a level sufficient to make a proper evaluation. So we just have to trust the Commission in the end. So again, being both judge and party. A last ethical related issue, which is of course of particular concern to us, is the issue of the relationship with arms export control. I'm not going to enter into the details of that because that's not really relevant for you, but it's what I want the point I want to make, is that we've been alerting on that right from the beginning of the processes. We were saying having this kind of joint program will have necessarily an impact on arms export controls at some point. You need to anticipate that. And they refused to listen. The European Commission didn't want to touch the issue, pretending that this was not their issue. National governments didn't either. So in the end, it is de facto happening, but in a form of vacuum. With only last-minute reaction, because nobody really wanted to connect those dots, not in the Commission, not in the Parliament, not in the Member States. Next slide, please. And as you can imagine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a major turning point, accelerating this process of defense readiness or militarization, and limiting further the transparency, the accountability, and the public debate. The key change at that moment is that civil society actors, particularly peace group, of course, but it's impacting, I think, beyond our specific sector, are de facto impeded to play their normal role of watchdog or counterbalancing the industry or private interest representation or influence on EU political processes. First, because we are overloaded by the number of proposals or initiatives put on the table. And also because the scope is broadening a lot. As you were mentioning at the beginning, so we started with purely military research and defense, then we moved to production, to acquisition, and now, as you mentioned, it's expanding to many other sectors, directly or indirectly. So there is really a capacity issue there, if you compare the capacity of peace groups or civil society at large compared with the capacity of the arms industry for our specific sector or the industry at large. The second major problem we face is the acceleration of the decision-making processes. Under the argument of urgency and security, the European Parliament even itself is kind of adopting urgency procedures, meaning that the processes of public debate in the Parliament are limited to 6 to 8 weeks instead of taking a few months. That also limits the capacity of civil society to intervene and to participate in those debates. They almost all the time, at least in the defense-related sector, bypass the plenary. Normally, the European Parliament has to adopt a position in plenary session before entering into negotiation with the Member States and the Commission. And this step is bypassed to accelerate the process, meaning that in the end, it's 1 or 2 specific committees expert on the topic, and among committees, a small group of MEPs who are experts, who are the ones making the decision and leading all the process up until the end. So that's also for us an important limitation of democratic processes and a balance of course representation of the different interests that are at play. And I will end with a recent move, which is a bit technical, but I'll try to make it clear because I think it's also a danger we all need to be aware. It's the abusive use of what is called delegated acts. It's a bit technical, but not that complicated. The delegated acts, it's a procedure that allows the European Commission to make a number of small technical decisions for the smooth implementation of a program. And that makes sense, no? Or a law or a directive. Member State and Parliament, they have 3 months to object. If they don't object, it's adopted, goes further. So usually it's very limited to very specific narrow areas, like a list of definition of a specific element or elements like that. I can give some examples. But we could see very recently, in particular, under these processes called simplification packages. So for those who are not from the EU bubble, it's a wide process of deregulating a number of environmental and social norms to facilitate business, let's say, to promote competitiveness, etc. You may have heard that in the news. It's the famous EU Green Deal being little by little dismantled or largely limited in order to not limit the industry in terms of competitiveness, etc. Under these big packages of deregulating a wide range of topics, including defense, a number of proposals have been done through delegated act, while in fact they are really addressing key political issues. In our area, for example, it's typically about the definition of controversial weapons. It's not a minor issue to discuss about the definition of controversial weapons because it has a lot of consequences afterwards. I'm not going to enter into the details, but I think it's a very telling example. So that's something we need to watch very rapidly, because the democratic processes is very limited for those type of acts. So it's really an abusive use of this power of delegated act from the part of the Commission. Then I will be very brief because I was asked to try maybe and start a bit of opening a discussion about this question of dual use, which is an important one. I'm not really an expert on it because we focus more on pure military stuff, but we could see a move from a concept that was used to control potential misuse to a concept to promote civil-military synergies. So there is there again an evolution. The initial point of having a dual use concept and control was to avoid this kind of misuse of outcomes or technologies or products from the civil area for non-intended military purposes. Since 2017 and the first policies and proposals to fund the military industry, there is an increased focus on the synergy. But the synergy is largely one way only, which is how civil policies can support one way or another or answer to military needs, and not so much the other way around. And more recently, and there is a link in the file in my slides that you may have access to later on, there is really an increasing blurring line between what is civil and military, and a push to go through a more even omni-use concept, which is kind of a big pot putting everything there, which is mainly driven again by readiness and competitiveness criteria, I would say. So those plans to support dual-use technologies, is that a threat or an opportunity? I don't really have an answer. I would not dare to lecture different sectors about how they approach that topic, because it's a complex one, definitely. But I would say that it's important to be aware of the current mindset, of the dominant mindset coming from the defense lens perspective of the EU. Because we tend to say EU defense policy, EU defense policy. Let's be clear, it's an EU defense industry policy. It's an EU arms industry policy driven, because that's the only competence that the EU has. So the DG, so-called DG DEFI, is the DG for defense industry and space. It's not a DG, a Directorate General for Defense at large, including all the aspects of defense. We don't have a commissioner for defense. It's always presented, Mr. Kubilius is always presented as commissioner for defense. He's the commissioner for the defense industry because he doesn't have competence on the rest of the aspect of defense in the wide sense. So I think it's very important to have that in mind, to see where this comes from and where it is intending to go. And also that I am afraid that issues about lack of public debate, democratic deficit, limits to transparency will expand to the other areas under this security argument. It's not going to work the other way around. So there is an issue about the losses in terms of those key elements for the other civil sectors once they enter into this big pot and dual use approach. Okay, I'll finish here. I hope it wasn't too technical, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have later on.
Thanks a lot, Laëtitia. Thanks a lot also for dedicating some time to explaining some of the EU processes that might not be familiar for our colleagues in the call. And you have already put very important things on the table that I would like the public to reflect for the Q&A, and especially after the next presentation, which is how this spillover effect that we are seeing in defense industry going from research to production to some other areas is affecting the health area, and specifically the medicines policies, and also how this acceleration of processes, this sense of urgency that we are already seeing in many files, because that's not only happening in this type of files. This acceleration is being seen, for instance, in the long-term budget. It's also per se and spillover effects of securitization, the sense of urgency, and that we are under some sort of threat, and that we cannot give the democratic process enough time. And finally, you have opened your presentation with a reference to the relationship between the defense industry and the European Commission that I really like, which you mentioned as a symbiotic relationship, and that's something that I would like to explore with the larger audience at the end, because we have traditionally focused on a particularly set of actors, big pharma, but not on some other actors that have vested interest in having a lot of money in the funds that can boost their market while serving other interests, but with the final objective of having more money for their industrial capacities. So now, please let me introduce you to our next guest speaker for a different perspective of securitization and access to medicines. She is Heba Wanis. She's a researcher in public health and development from Third World Network. She is interested in access to medicines as a fundamental component to the right to health, and particularly focuses on pharmaceutical policy, drug regulation, pricing, and intellectual property. She authored and contributed to several publications in this area, and she currently works with DWN and leads their work in Egypt. So world-class expert that will now discuss on this very specific topic, but in the context of Egypt. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jaime. Thank you for having invited me to participate in this webinar. Let me share my screen. You see my screen now?
No, you're good to go.
Yeah. So the angle I'm going to adopt, of course, is quite different from the one adopted by Laëtitia. Sorry, I don't seem to see my screen. Yeah. I'm going, of course, to refer to the Egyptian context and cover some of the recent changes to drug regulation and market and access from a securitization angle. I cannot move my screens, my slides.
Okay.
Do you mind sharing it?
I will take control. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I sent you the latest version. Sorry about that. Make sure to present the latest one. Yes, thank you very much. First of all, a bit of a background about Egypt. Egypt is a country with a population currently estimated to be 119 million. It is a net drug importing country with imported raw material comprising 90 to 95% of the components of locally produced medicines, according to the pharmaceutical chamber. There is a national health insurance system covering nearly half of the population. And there is a new universal health coverage program that has been approved and is being gradually implemented in selected governorates in Egypt. Out-of-pocket expenditure on health and health products is quite high in Egypt, standing at 62.75%. And most of this goes to medicines, by the way. For the past 10 years, the economic condition has been quite volatile, often described as impoverishing, when seen in light of how health, education, and nutrition are affected as expenditure categories by Egyptian households. Next slide, please. Now moving to the pharmaceutical industry. Egypt has a sizable pharmaceutical manufacturing base dating back to 1935, and it's a diversified industry with public, state-owned companies, privately owned companies, and transnational corporations represented as well. Historically, it's been a highly regulated sector, despite the changes to regulatory mechanisms and priorities. And I'm going to cover this a bit later. There are local pharmaceutical companies with far-sighted research and development plans. They've established themselves in the local, regional, and international markets through licensing agreements and joint technological ventures. So there is a base to build upon. Now moving to recent changes to drug regulation. To look into securitization, it is important to examine the changes which have recently taken place in the drug sector. And some of these changes were structural in nature, while others had to do with the mindset and culture of how the sector is run. With I'm referring to the mindset of security. One of the major structural changes that took place was in 2019, and it had to do with Law 151 about the establishment of two new and independent entities, the Egyptian Drug Authority, in a new form, of course, and the Egyptian Authority for Unified Procurement, Medical Supply, and Technology Management. And we refer to it as the Unified Procurement Authority, the UPA. Next slide, please, Jaime. The new Egyptian Drug Authority structure, now independent from the Ministry of Health, replaced a long-standing structure in Egypt that had three complementary entities operating under the Ministry of Health: the Central Administration of Pharmaceutical Affairs, the National Organization for Drug Control and Research, and the National Organization for Research, Control and Control of Biologicals. The change to structure and hierarchy meant shrinking the actual size and mandates of these entities, which used to be independent, research-oriented organizations, to merely administrative entities, more or less, because now the whole dossier is managed and run by the Egyptian Drug Authority, which is independent from the Ministry of Health. Next slide, please. Now, a closer look at unified procurement as a newly introduced concept. The Unified Procurement Authority was granted exclusive control over purchases related to medicines and medical supplies for the government. And it provides the procurement service against a charge, a fee of 7% of the net purchase value. And prior to its establishment, again, a long-standing system that existed in Egypt, healthcare providers would run tenders to procure their medicines and medical supplies. And it is important to note here that healthcare provision in Egypt is quite large and diverse in terms of size and number of providers. And these providers, of course, cater to all population segments, albeit in a rather fragmented manner. So, for example, public hospitals could be run by different entities or ministries. It could be the Ministry of Health for some of the hospitals, or the Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research in case of university or teaching hospitals. Added to this, there are facilities that are run by the National Insurance Organization and other ministries that do have their health facilities to cater for their employees. So it's a rather complex ecosystem to operate within. And with the Unified Procurement Authority in place, procurement became limited to a single and central entity, which was a drastic change, of course, if you think about it. Next slide, please, Jaime. Now, how did the concept of unified procurement originate, and how was the UPA conceived in the first place? There's a background to this. In 2015, the Ministry of Health transferred the license to import and distribute medicines from the state-owned company, which is the Egyptian Company for Trade in Pharmaceuticals, to the Ministry of Defense, represented by the National Service Projects Organization. And this move was justified as a response to rising prices in the market. And this case was related, in fact, at the time to baby formula, which was primarily and still is primarily imported. In 2016, the Ministry of Defense won the exclusive right from the Ministry of Health to procure and import medical supplies on behalf of the government, following which trade negotiations were held. And this led to the formation of a unified procurement committee. The authority was not established yet, but we've been through the transition where a unified procurement committee was established, headed by an Egyptian armed forces major general. Again, managed by the Ministry of Defense. 1 year later, the committee's mandate expanded from merely supplying military medical facilities to cover the whole Egyptian public health system. So during that time, the centralization of procurement was rather normalized and ultimately led to the establishment of the Unified Procurement Authority in 2019, which again started by being headed by an armed forces general trained as a medical doctor. Between 2019 and 2024, the UPA led to pharmaceutical market crises caused by accumulation of debts to supplying companies, leading to many exiting the market. If you can move the change. Thank you very much. At that time, a lot of companies exited the market. Currently, some product prices are being raised to compensate for the large debts that the UPA owes to producers, and the debts are claimed to have reached 40 billion Egyptian pounds. There were severe shortages in hospital supplies, such as surgical materials and anesthetics, and the crisis was also aggravated by the decrease of foreign currency exchange rate in the parallel market at the time. In January 2025, a new UPA president assumed office, and he brought the experience of the public health pharmaceutical sector. However, the situation did not change much, necessitating amendments of the UPA mandate in September 2025. I mean, that's quite recent, by a presidential directive. And this followed severe shortages of critical medicines that has affected hospitals affiliated to the General Authority for Health Insurance, for example. And under this new system, the UPA's role will be limited oversight and will no longer act as a direct financial party in procurement or payment. There's going to be always a third party involved. Next slide, please. Now we move to a different aspect of the changing pharmaceutical ecosystem, which is the centralization of production as a mindset and a vision. This is demonstrated by the Medicine City. The Egyptian Medicine City, also called Egypto City Pharma, is a mega project that is developed and implemented by the Egyptian government with the aim of providing local needs of medicines and ending monopolistic practices and controlling prices on the market. According to the official website of the Medicine City. Despite its ambitious and noble vision, the project is founded on the concept of centralization of industry. At the time when we have a solid pharmaceutical industrial foundation to build upon. A recent research on the role of transport technology in the pharmaceutical sector attempted to study the case of the Medicine City, but could not obtain much information. The researcher failed to reach the management and leadership of the Medicine City. However, one important information reached is that the whole project is affiliated to the National Service Project Organization of the Ministry of Defense. So again, it's a reflection of this mindset on the whole sector. To conclude, in a few points, there have been fundamental structural and institutional changes to drug regulation in Egypt, following, of course, a securitization approach through the change and merging of mandates, as well as gradual independence from the Ministry of Health. Procurement of medicines and medical supplies has gone through massive changes by being centralized, again, the same mindset, and by involving various other entities besides the Egyptian Drug Authority and the Ministry of Health, both of which are mandated with the dossier. The pharmaceutical industry, as envisioned by the government in the form of the Medicine City, is being operationalized in a centralized manner under the leadership of an armed forces entity. Changes to procurement mechanisms, while aimed at addressing corruption and controlling prices, have led to market shortages and rising prices in response to rising debts and unpaid dues to suppliers, including the local industry. So it is crucial and timely to examine the current situation in terms of access to medicines and medical supplies in order to answer the question of whether such structural changes have actually delivered. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for condensating such a vast amount of information in these 15 minutes. I think that you have brought very interesting topics that I wanted also to bring up right now about the role of centralization in delivering, because this is a common motto when it comes to the securitization we are seeing in different contexts for access to medicines, and how joint procurements appear as kind of a silver bullet for a different array of problems. You have mentioned that some of the initial things were concerning affordability, but also addressing corruption, were later a possible explanation of why they were doing all these reforms. And this also brings some questions, because joint procurement it is a tool in itself. It could deliver both a affordable or non-affordable, transparent or not transparent products at the end. So this is something that we will need to reflect on later on. I want to show a few slides to wrap it up. So Moga, is it something that you want to say right now, or shall I wrap up a little bit with a conceptual framework of what both presenters have said, and then if you're okay, I can open for Q&A for both presenters. Is that okay, Moga? Give me a thumbs up or something in the chat. You have your hand is down now, so I will assume that you can wait. But I remember Moga has a question for Heba. Please, I think now I'm going to be the one not seeing any screen. So if any other panelist can tell me if I'm presenting. Yes, we should.
You are, yes.
Okay. So I'm going to try to wrap up quickly with some insights that we have gathered from Europe, but that relates completely to some of the logics that we have explored today also from Egypt. We have been checking the Health Security Committee reports in the European Union since its inception in 2020 until today to see what were the potential drivers of the emergence of this securitization within the access to medicines realm, which is not new, but it's intensifying somehow. So there are different things that have brought this a mixture of civil and military cooperation, as the HAC names it, that are related to the COVID-19 pandemic, where it started, to supply chain vulnerabilities that were detected during COVID-19, a change of threat paradigms of hybrid threats and different type of threats that were important for European defense, but also for a demand for rapid logistics when it comes to PPPR, pandemic preparedness, prevention and response, but also of a common EU-NATO agenda. So what we can see as a quick and dry conceptual idea of how this is working is that from these documents, and this has been discussed by many others, including Germán Velázquez from South Center, is that we are not leading with essential medicines anymore. We are dealing with medical countermeasures. So that's something that needs to be secure and stockpiled and distributed, but it's not framed at all in the same way we have been framing essential medicines, diagnostics, and vaccines in the past. And this is gathered beneath the umbrella of the capability logic, which relates to the Egyptian case in the sense that the military, the securitization approach appears as the one that can deal with logistics, continuity of supply, and to a high threat, sorry for the typo there, environment. So as an actor that is capable to deal with problems that others could not in the past. You call it vulnerability of supply, or as in the Egyptian case, high prices and corruption. And the governance architecture when it comes to medicines changed a little bit. There are traditional actors such as HERA, the Health and Emergency Response Authority on DG Sante, but there are others that are new, such as NATO of the Health Security Committee, who appears operating in some other ways. So we have two different paradigms, one about health access, where we traditionally deal and advocate for equity, transparency, affordability, and other related issues. And then the health security that changes not only the terminology and started to discuss on medical countermeasures, but also changes completely the framework and moved that to a more military security-sized risk-based prioritization, resilience, and readiness. So there are key questions that we should be asking ourselves when engaging with these new actors, and I will present now a specific case to open the discussions. First of all, are prices, financing, procurement terms compatible with equitable public access? We have seen that one of the objectives of the pharmacy in Egypt was ending monopolistic practice, but are they ending monopolistic practices and at the end, are they ensuring equitable public access? Does these strategies to improve supply reliability beyond crisis scenarios exist? And what happened with all this opacity that Laëtitia has been mentioning? Are contracts, prices, and allocations rules public, or is security being used to justify opacity? And how equitable distribution can be thought within these allocation frameworks? How do ensure cross-border solidarity? For instance, DJ Hera was deemed by a CEPS report not suitable to use the EU FAB, which is the facility that creates a capability of producing vaccines and response to health emergencies, not suitable to export to low and middle income countries because of operational capacity. So where is cross-border solidarity and justice in these allocation frameworks? And are emergency logics becoming normalized and military roles bounded and subject to democratic oversight? Quick example of this is what we have been seeing in the Critical Medicines Act. All political groups have been amended that the Critical Medicines Act objectives shall be funded with European defense funds. You can see all the groups here putting different amendments on the same line, even discussing dual-use manufacturing enablers, which, as per Laëtitia's presentation, is pretty problematic for a number of reasons. And this is also very difficult to track because we are dealing with a different set of actors. This is one quick analysis we did on lobbying on European Parliament representatives during the Critical Medicines Act negotiation, and you can see all these red dots, that is pharma companies that have been lobbying MEPs, but we could not track if there were defense industry lobbyists within this CMEA to explain why all these European...
Sorry to interrupt, but the slides are not moving.
Oh. No one is seeing the slides moving?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's problematic. I can reopen them now, or I can share them later on because I cannot reshare the screen.
Apologies for that. It seems like we have lost Jaime for a bit. Until Jaime comes back, maybe we can move to the couple of questions that I have seen in the chat. There's one from Dr. Amna Said, directed to Heba. The question is, could you clarify how production centralization is expected to reduce monopolies in Egypt, especially in terms of lowering medicine prices?
Yes, thank you, Amna, and let me respond to this quickly. In fact, it's the mindset that controls, introducing this concept. I believe that production centralization will not be conducive to encouraging generic competition, on which we do rely here in Egypt for affordable prices. But it's in fact the mindset that that is behind this vision, because historically the military has always owned factories, and mid 20th century these factories and following the wars, so 70s and 80s, these factories provided electrical appliances, for example. I mean, there are armed forces factories that do production for general consumption by the population. It's not only arms. So this has been the approach to industry and to production, and bringing this approach to the realm of medicines is actually what I try to examine in my slides. And of course, by centralizing production, I mean, in theory, you would reach economies of scale, of course. So perhaps the prices would be dropped, but then we miss out on competition. We actually we have to think about other producers here in Egypt who would be affected, who would be pushed out of the market. Also an important point to keep in mind is that the involvement of armed forces in production is always related to subsidizing the final price and cost of this product in case this product reaches the public. So subsidization entails a cost, and this cost will be borne by the armed forces, obviously, and it is a body that is exempted from taxation. So the point of subsidization is important to consider here because of its cost, of course. And I still believe that it's important to consider other players on the market. Procuring medicines in Egypt for public facilities has always been done through tenders. So there is always a space for bargaining. The final price is always discussed and negotiated by the government. The government has always had the upper hand when it comes to pricing and price negotiations, which is a good thing. So tendering has always guaranteed good prices, decent prices. We lose this in case of too much centralization. These are the 2 points I have in mind. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Heba. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I was wondering if anyone has further questions. Moga, please go ahead, and then followed by Jaime Vidal. Moga, the floor is yours. It seems like you're muted, Jaime. Maybe you can go ahead, and we'll wait until Moga is ready.
You should be able now, Jaime, to open your mic.
Okay. Not only my mic, but also my camera. Say hi to everyone. First of all, thank you for Derecho. Thank you, Laëtitia and Heba, for these really good presentations. I think that really on point stuff. I really like what Laëtitia was saying about the defense funds and how Parliament renounced to really the ability to oversight. And I think that it's something that it's repeating itself again in other areas, especially like when we are talking about contracts, when we are talking about negotiations for joint procurement, for instance, where Parliament is left out of the room. And also, I think like when you were talking about dual use, I think it's very interesting when right now we are dealing with artificial intelligence, and we have like AI Act, and it's been really hard to get like safeguards on AI regarding healthcare. I don't want to imagine like the impact of AI on defense. And then we can see there is a lot of public funded research on AI that at the end can be used in the military field, but also impact on the life of civilians. And I think it's really, I mean, it's not interesting. It's deeply unsettling when you see like the impact of the regulation also on access to medicines and how really it's really like the same playbook being used. And for me, the question is what is left for civil society, for like pressure groups to do when parliament is like systematically sidelined. And we are seeing also, I think it's really good that I think that Grupo Derecho knows like a thing or two about freedom of information acts and demands of information and how hard is it to get this. I mean, what's the next step? And also, I think it's really good. Like Egypt, I think it's like a really good example. I was wondering while I was listening to you. I remember like the role that Farco had when like to produce like generic versions of Soposbuvir. And I think it's interesting what you were describing in terms of like the domestic pharmaceutical market, how like the presence of the army can really push out other like actors, and at the end it makes it more difficult and more expensive for citizens to get medicines. And I really would like to do this reflection now when we are some people are saying, yeah, we should have like a growing role of like defense authorities in guaranteeing supply of medicines, for instance, or the NATO looking at health security. I think it's interesting to see like the role of like the army in Argentina developing new vaccines, like the army in the US negotiating prices of medicines. In Pakistan, also like even it's like very entrepreneurial actor. It's really you see plenty of warnings. It's not that the warning is on the wall; it's on the board walls. You see, and I think that in Egypt we have like the added factor of really like limited civic space. But in Europe, even though they are really trying to curtail the space, we still have some space. We still have some voice that to push back. And I think it's interesting, and I really think and that this webinar was good for this. I mean, because I learned a lot. You see, it's really getting this like what can happen there can happen here, what happened before can happen now, and I think it's really good to connect. So I think that this started like a question and then became a commentary, and I think that it's just really a great presentation. Thank you.
Do any of you, Laëtitia or Heba, want to comment on Jaume's intervention?
I'm happy to comment now maybe on some points about the role of the parliament with space left, but maybe I don't know if Moga has questions which relates a bit to that, then maybe we can also let her have her and then we put all answers together.
Sure, go ahead, Moga.
Okay, you're muted.
Or maybe you're unmuted, but your mic is not working. A final reflection was
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you?
Mhm.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So my point is that we've been wanting for decades to raise health and access to medicine as a political issue for governments. And I think probably since COVID, it has become a security issue. So on the one hand, well, great. It's an important issue because it's security and therefore it's almost as important as the military. But the problem is what it brought with that is with the military, everything is untransparent because, of course, it's military, national security, whatever. So as you say, Laëtitia, it's transparency is out of the window, public accountability is out of the window. So it's kind of, it seems like it's moved to that direction in some countries, like in Egypt. I personally think a centralized procurement agency is not in itself a bad idea. We have the NHS here in the UK. It can pool demand and therefore have, as you said, Heba, has the big volume. So it has the power of negotiation, like what UNICEF does, what Gavi does, to get lower prices. Now, whether that happens or not in Egypt is a big question mark, whether it's lack of expertise or whatever it is. I don't really know the reason why they're not getting that, because I know there is a big problem of shortages and high prices. That's in addition to the inflation, of course. So that's one thing. But the other thing that attracted my attention in your presentation, Heba, is just mentioning the fact that we know about was it 95 or something% of active ingredients, or basically all the ingredients, come from abroad, is imported. And this is the case in Africa. In the whole of the continent, there's only 2 companies that produce the active ingredients at a very small scale in South Africa, very small scale. And that's a big thing. So if the country in Egypt or the military or whoever want to have this, what did you call it, industrial hub or something, a la Singapore, for example. Yeah. Why don't they have that to do the active ingredient, and therefore they can cut the price of medicines, they create technology, the technological advancements, they create jobs. It's a more than a health strategy. It's an industrial strategy and a technological strategy. And they can export to the whole of Africa if they do that, instead of just playing with the procurement, which has a lot of, dare one say, corruption potential. Thank you. It's the linkages between the lack of transparency on the military and the lack of transparency on medicine is incredible.
True. In fact, if I can quickly respond to Mohga's point, this is the vision behind it, Mohga, to produce API, and this is the vision that the government continues to call localization of the pharmaceutical industry. So of course the phrasing it insinuates that we're starting from scratch. This is not the case. The alarming thing is that this whole vision and the land and the premises are owned and run by the armed forces. So in fact, this raises questions. But of course, I'm very happy to see Egypt producing APIs and exporting to the rest of the world. And this is the vision that a lot of small companies, existing companies, have as well. And thank you for raising this.
So thank you everyone for the questions. I'm going to check quickly if there is something in the chat, but just because I had a problems with wrapping on the presentation, just a few things to have in thought. I'm going to link it to one European process, which because it's where Salud por Derecho is primarily working. We need to monitorize what are the developments for the Critical Medicines Act. That is going to a plenary vote in the European Parliament, and all the mentions to European defense funds have been dropped, which is good, and it's something that Salud por Derecho has been advocating with all the rapporteurs. So they have disappeared from the Parliament position, but the Ministry of Health for a number of countries, including Spain, had advocated in the past in an op-ed in Euronews of using using the European defense funds for the Critical Medicines Act strategic projects. So this is something that we should be keep an eye on. And also there are questions of implementation of, for instance, the Article 9.5 of the pandemic agreement, because in most jurisdictions, everything that has to be related to the military has a strong confidentiality clauses. So, for instance, in the Spanish law, pharmaceutical net prices and so on are not subject to transparency law. But what is, of course, and out of the table for more of the decision makers and probably the judiciary, the courts won't have a doubt is military money and military products. That's for sure out of transparency law, and I don't know if what will happen with the public conditions that the Article 9.5 of the pandemic agreement stipulate when it comes for things that have been funded with military money. So those are things that I think we should be keeping an eye on, and also potential trends in future regional and national developments. We probably organize a similar webinar later this year to resume this topic and gather in different policy developments that there have been in order to assess how securitization is developing in access to medicines, both in Europe and globally. And we will share with all the people that have registered the presentations, and also a brief readout with the key points on this and resources for advocates to use this in their context. So thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. Thanks a lot to Laëtitia, to Heba, and also to all of you who have registered and attended until the end. We hope we see you in the next webinar that we have already. Next date is February 19. We will be sharing the save the date soon, and we will talk actually about conditionalities in funding instruments, specifically on the European FP10, but also on implementation of the Pandemic Agreement 9.5. And we will raise again this topic of how securitization will impact conditions to public funding of medicines. Thanks a lot, and see you all very soon. Thanks a lot, Laëtitia. Thanks a lot, Heba, for your time.
Thanks for the invitation and interesting discussion.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jaime. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.